My husband divorced me on our honeymoon. I shouted. How dare you do this? My mother-in-law slapped me hard and said, in my family, there is no space for a cheap girl. They abandoned me and left the place. But I took a bold step, and before they arrived home, a shocking surprise awaited them. My name is Elena, and this is the story of how I was betrayed by the man I loved, humiliated by his family, and left alone to suffer, only to rise stronger than ever. I met Daniel during my college years in Los Angeles, California. He was charming, intelligent, and full of life. From the very beginning, he made me feel like I was the most special person in the world. We spent countless evenings studying together, laughing over coffee, and making plans for the future. Daniel wasn't just my boyfriend. He was my best friend, my safe place, and my greatest love. When he proposed to me after 5 years of being together, I didn't hesitate to say yes. I was ecstatic. But there was just one problem: his mother, Margaret. Margaret was never happy about our relationship. She saw me as someone beneath her family's status. A girl like you has nothing to offer, Daniel, she once told me coldly when we first met. It didn't matter that I had a stable career or that I truly loved her son. To her, I was a nobody. But Daniel always reassured me. Don't worry about her, he would say, holding my hand. She'll come around eventually. I love you, and that's all that matters. I believed him. I trusted him. Despite Margaret's disapproval, we got married. At first, it felt like a dream. Daniel and I moved into a beautiful apartment, and life seemed perfect. But the illusion didn't last long. Margaret would visit constantly, uninvited. Every time she came over, she would comment on everything I did. You don't even know how to take care of a house properly, she would say while inspecting my kitchen. Or worse, she would say things like, a woman's real value is measured by her wealth. Love doesn't pay the bills. I knew she didn't like me, but I never expected what she had planned next. A month after our wedding, Daniel and I planned our honeymoon trip. It was supposed to be our first real escape, just the two of us, away from everything. I was beyond excited. For once, it would be just Daniel and me, no interference, no tension. But the night before we were set to leave, Margaret made an unbelievable announcement. I'm coming with you, she said casually over dinner, sipping her wine like it was the most natural thing in the world. I nearly choked on my food. What? Daniel didn't even look at me. He just sighed and said, Mom, are you sure? I mean, this is our honeymoon. Of course, I'm sure, Margaret replied, setting down her glass. It's been so long since I traveled, and I think we'll have much more fun together as a family. A part of me expected Daniel to say no, to stand up for me, but he didn't. He just nodded and said, I guess it'll be fine, Elena. Let's not make a big deal out of it. Not make a big deal out of it? I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. This was supposed to be about us, not Margaret. Why was she always in our marriage? But I stayed quiet. I had spent so long trying to keep the peace that I swallowed my anger and convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be that bad. I was so wrong. When we reached our honeymoon destination, something felt off. Daniel was acting nervous, checking his phone constantly. And then, at the airport, a young woman was waiting for us. She was beautiful, confident, and well-dressed. A woman who clearly belonged to the world Margaret admired. Sophia, you're here. Margaret greeted her warmly, hugging her like an old friend. Sophia smiled, glancing at me briefly before focusing on Daniel. Finally, we meet in person, she said, her voice dripping with familiarity. I looked at Daniel, confused. Who was she? Why was she acting like she knew my husband? And then Margaret turned to me, her eyes cold and cruel. Elena, this is Sophia, she said, her lips curling into a smirk. She's going to be Daniel's new wife. The world stopped. I stared at them, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. What are you talking about? I managed to whisper, feeling my hands shake. Margaret let out a small laugh. Oh, sweetheart, don't act surprised. Did you really think you were going to stay in this family forever? I turned to Daniel, desperate, begging with my eyes for him to tell me this was a mistake. Daniel, tell me this is a joke, I pleaded. Tell me she's lying. He looked away. I'm sorry, Elena, he muttered, avoiding my gaze. But I don't have a choice. My entire world shattered. I stepped back, feeling like I couldn't breathe. You don't have a choice? I repeated, my voice shaking. What does that even mean? That's when Margaret delivered the final blow. It means that if he doesn't divorce you and marry Sophia, he's out of the family business. No money. No power. Nothing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own husband, my Daniel, was choosing money over me. I couldn't hold back my tears. How could you? I whispered. How could you do this to me, Daniel? Before I could say another word, Margaret slapped me. Hard. I gasped, my face burning from the force of it. Shut your mouth, she hissed. You are nothing. You were never good enough for us. Daniel still said nothing. He just stood there as his mother humiliated me. As if he had already made his decision. Sign the divorce papers, Daniel, Margaret instructed. And then, as if I was nothing more than an inconvenience, my husband took the papers and signed them. Just like that, our marriage was over. Sophia smiled, taking Daniel's arm like she had won a prize. Come on, darling, she purred. We have a wedding to plan. I watched as they got into the car, leaving me standing there, alone, broken, discarded. Margaret rolled down the window one last time, sneering. There's no place for cheap girls like you in our family. Then they drove away. I stood there, my heart ripped apart, my world completely shattered. But as the tears fell down my face, something inside me changed. They thought they could break me. They thought they could walk away, without consequences. They had no idea who they were messing with. And that was the moment I decided I was going to get revenge. I stood frozen, watching the car disappear into the distance. My own husband, the man I trusted, had betrayed me in the most humiliating way possible. Margaret's cruel words echoed in my mind, and my cheek still burned from her slap. I felt numb, as if my body had given up on feeling anything at all. For a while, I just stood there, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The man who once held me in his arms and promised to love me forever had left me like I was nothing. Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to breathe. The world around me blurred, my legs weak beneath me. I was alone. Truly alone. I didn't know how long I stood there until I finally forced myself to move. I needed to get out of there, away from the place where my life had just been torn apart. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person I knew would stand by me no matter what. Ryan, my younger brother. Elena? His voice was sharp with concern the moment he picked up. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. A choked sob escaped instead. Elena, what happened? Are you okay? I inhaled shakily, my voice barely above a whisper. He left me, Ryan. Daniel left me for someone else. There was a long silence. Then, in a low, controlled voice, Ryan asked, "Where are you?" I gave him the address, and before I could even say anything else, he said, "Stay right there. I'm coming to get you." By the time Ryan arrived, I had collapsed onto a bench outside the airport, staring blankly ahead. The moment I saw him, I felt everything hit me at once. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the sheer humiliation of being abandoned so easily. Ryan crouched in front of me, gripping my shoulders. "Tell me everything." Through my sobs, I told him what happened. How Margaret had orchestrated everything. How she had found a wealthy businesswoman for Daniel to marry. How Daniel had chosen money and power over me. How he had signed the divorce papers right in front of me and left without a second thought. Ryan's jaw clenched as he listened, his hands tightening into fists. That bastard. That absolute bastard. I wiped my face, my voice hollow. What am I supposed to do now? He destroyed me, Ryan. He took everything from me and walked away like I was nothing. Ryan took a deep breath, his expression turning dangerously calm. "You're not going to sit here and cry, that's for sure. You're going to fight back." I frowned. Fight back? How? Ryan's eyes burned with determination. "We're going to find out everything about Margaret, Sophia, and Daniel. There's no way they're as perfect as they pretend to be. You think a woman like Sophia just magically appears, and Margaret suddenly decides she's the perfect daughter-in-law? Something doesn't add up. For the first time since this nightmare began, a spark of hope ignited inside me. He was right. Margaret had orchestrated this whole thing too perfectly. There had to be something, some weakness, some secret that could bring them down. Ryan didn't waste time. He called a private investigator that he had worked with before on cases. Within an hour, we had someone digging into Margaret's business, Sophia's past, and Daniel's finances. While we waited for results, Ryan took me back to his house. I sat in his living room, numb but determined. "Do you still love him?" Ryan asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Did I? The man I loved had vanished the moment I saw who he truly was. I shook my head. I loved the person I thought he was. But that man doesn't exist anymore. Ryan nodded approvingly. Good. Because when we take them down, I don't want you hesitating. They wouldn't hesitate to destroy you. A week passed, and the private investigator finally returned with shocking evidence. Margaret wasn't just running a business. She was running an empire built on fraud, illegal dealings, and smuggling. And Sophia? She was involved too. Her entire fortune was tied to dirty money. But the most surprising part? Daniel knew everything. He had been helping them cover up their crimes for years. I felt my breath catch as I read the reports. He was involved this whole time? Ryan nodded grimly. That's why Margaret was so confident. She knew Daniel wouldn't refuse her, because he was already deep in it. If he stepped out of line, she could destroy him too. A slow, cold anger settled inside me. All those years, I thought I was building a future with a good man. Instead, I had been living with a liar. Ryan leaned forward. Elena, it's time. We take this to the authorities. We bring them down. I stared at the documents, my hands shaking. This was it. My chance to make them pay for what they did to me. I took a deep breath and nodded. Let's do it. Ryan immediately made the calls. By the end of the day, the police had everything they needed. A plan was put into motion. A raid was scheduled. Soon, we would have them trapped with no way out. The night before the operation, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I had been weak before. A victim. But now? Now I was ready. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. The morning of the raid arrived, and I stood by Ryan's side, watching as the police finalized their preparations. My heart pounded in my chest, but this time, it wasn't from fear or heartbreak. It was from something stronger, determination. For so long, I had felt powerless, but today, that was going to change. Today, Daniel, Margaret, and Sophia would face the consequences of their greed and betrayal. Ryan handed me a cup of coffee, his expression serious. You okay? I nodded. I will be after today. The police had everything planned perfectly. Their targets, Daniel, Margaret, and Sophia, had no idea that the warehouse where they conducted their illegal dealings was already under surveillance. The authorities had enough evidence to charge them with fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Ryan and I were stationed at a safe distance, watching as undercover officers moved into position. My fingers tightened around my cup as I thought about the people I once considered family. Margaret had stolen my husband from me, Sophia had taken my place, and Daniel had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Now they were about to pay for it all. Moments later, a sleek black car pulled up outside the warehouse. Even from a distance, I recognized the figures stepping out. Margaret, Sophia, and Daniel. Sophia walked ahead confidently, her designer heels clicking against the pavement, while Margaret whispered something to her. Daniel trailed behind them, looking anxious. They have no idea what's coming, Ryan muttered beside me. I watched as they entered the warehouse, the doors shutting behind them. A few minutes later, the police moved in. Sirens blared, and the officers stormed inside, surrounding them before they could even react. Through the surveillance footage on a nearby monitor, I saw Margaret's eyes widen in shock, Sophia frozen in place, and Daniel looking around in a panic. The officers shouted commands, forcing them to the ground. Margaret tried to argue, but it was useless. She was handcuffed within seconds. Sophia screamed in protest, and Daniel, he just looked terrified. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was what they deserved. The next few hours passed in a blur. Daniel, Margaret, and Sophia were taken into custody, and the police gathered more evidence from the warehouse. Ryan and I were asked to come to the station to provide statements, and I found myself staring at the glass windows separating us from the holding cells. I watched as Margaret sat stiffly, her face pale. Sophia paced back and forth, cursing under her breath, and Daniel sat hunched over, his head in his hands. I didn't feel sorry for any of them. A police officer approached me. "Would you like to speak with them before the trial?" I hesitated, but then nodded. I wanted to look them in the eyes one last time. Ryan gave me a warning look. "Don't let them get to you." I took a deep breath before stepping into the room where Daniel was being held. As soon as he saw me, he stood up, his expression desperate. "Elena, you did this?" I crossed my arms, my voice steady. "You did this to yourself, Daniel." His face twisted in frustration. "You don't understand. Margaret forced me into everything. I had no choice." I let out a short laugh. "No choice? That's funny, because I remember you having a choice the day you signed our divorce papers and left me standing alone." He flinched. I took a step closer, my voice lower. "You were a part of this from the beginning, weren't you? You knew exactly what Margaret and Sophia were involved in. You didn't just betray me. You sold your own soul for money." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking frantic. "I can fix this. We can start over. Please, Elena, you don't understand what's going to happen to me in here." I stared at him, feeling nothing but disgust. "You should have thought about that before you ruined my life." I turned to leave, but before I walked out the door, I looked back at him one last time. "Good luck, Daniel. You're going to need it." As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Margaret and Sophia didn't even deserve a conversation. They had made it clear long ago that I meant nothing to them, and now they meant nothing to me. The day of the trial came faster than I expected. The courtroom was filled with people, reporters, former business associates, and employees who had once admired Margaret's empire. Now, they were all here to watch it crumble. Ryan sat beside me as the charges were read. Fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. One by one, the evidence was presented: bank records, intercepted messages, surveillance footage. There was no way out for them. When the judge finally spoke, his voice rang through the silent courtroom. "The defendants are found guilty on all charges." There was a loud murmur in the room as the verdict sank in. Daniel turned in his seat to look at me, his eyes filled with desperation. "Elena, please." I simply smiled. Tit for tat, Daniel. Margaret's face was red with fury, and Sophia's arrogant expression had completely disappeared. The final sentences were announced. Years in prison. No way out. No more power, no more wealth. Just consequences. I took a deep breath, letting it all sink in. The nightmare was finally over. I had won. As I stepped out of the courtroom, a wave of relief washed over me. It was over. The people who had betrayed me, humiliated me, and left me broken were finally facing the consequences of their actions. Justice had been served. Ryan walked beside me, hands in his pockets, watching my face carefully. "How do you feel?" he asked. I let out a slow breath. Free. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. No more heartbreak. No more looking over my shoulder. No more feeling like I wasn't enough. I had spent so much time wondering if I had made a mistake by marrying Daniel, if there was something I could have done differently. But standing here, watching him being taken away in handcuffs, I realized something important. I was never the problem. Margaret had always hated me. Daniel had always been weak. And Sophia had been waiting for an opportunity. They had destroyed themselves. I had only helped to reveal the truth. Ryan and I walked out of the courthouse, past the reporters, past the whispers of people who once admired Daniel's family. None of them mattered anymore. As soon as we got outside, Ryan pulled out his phone. "Come on, we need to celebrate." "Where do you want to go?" I laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. "Anywhere that serves strong drinks and good food." That night, we sat in a restaurant, talking about everything except what had happened. For once, I wasn't thinking about Daniel. I wasn't thinking about Margaret, Sophia, or the betrayal. I was thinking about the future. My future. Over the next few weeks, my life slowly started falling back into place. I moved into my own apartment, one that belonged to me and no one else. I started focusing on my career again, rebuilding the dreams that had been put on hold because of my marriage. Daniel had once told me that I was nothing without him. But the truth was, I was better without him. Margaret and Sophia had thought they could destroy me. Instead, I had watched them destroy themselves. Every now and then, I would hear updates about Daniel. He was struggling in prison, cut off from the luxury he had once enjoyed. His old business partners had turned against him, and with Margaret and Sophia locked up, he had no one left to protect him. Ryan and I would hear rumors, how he begged former friends for help, how he regretted everything, how he wished he had never left me. But I didn't care. I had wasted enough time caring about Daniel. One day, as I was leaving work, my phone rang. An unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Hellos. There was silence on the other end. Then, a voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Elena, it's me. I stopped walking. The voice was hoarse, weaker than I remembered, but I knew exactly who it was.
Daniel.
I clenched my jaw. What do you want? There was a long pause. I just wanted to hear your voice. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, pity, disbelief. He sounded broken, desperate. But I wasn't the same woman he had abandoned. I wasn't the same woman who had begged him not to leave. I had no more tears for him. It's too late for that, Daniel. He sighed, and for the first time, I could hear regret. Real regret. I lost everything, Elena. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. You lost me, and that should have been enough to stop you from making the choices you did. He didn't respond. He knew it was true. After a long silence, he finally whispered, Do you think we could ever fix this? I almost laughed. Fix this? After everything? I shook my head. No, Daniel. We're beyond fixing. Before he could say anything else, I hung up the phone. And just like that, I closed the last door to my past. From that day forward, I never looked back. I had survived. I had won. And now I was finally free.